It was Halloween night 2023. For most people, it was just another evening filled with candy, costumes, and the happy sounds of kids laughing as they ran from house to house. But for Hannah, who lived in a quiet house on the very edge of town, this Halloween would turn into something she'd never, ever forget. The night was starting to wind down. Around 9:30 p.m., the stream of trick-or-treaters had slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether. Hannah was curled up on her couch, a classic horror movie playing on the TV when she heard it. A soft knock at the front door. Not the usual enthusiastic banging of kids high on sugar. This was different. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Tap, tap, tap. She paused her movie, a little surprised someone was still out this late. When she opened the door, there stood a small boy. He looked to be about 8 years old, dressed in an old-fashioned clown costume that seemed out of place, like something from a forgotten era. His face, visible around the edges of his mask, was unnaturally pale, almost gray. The mask itself looked handmade paper thin, with crudely drawn-on red lips and 2 hollow black holes for eyes. He didn't say, "Trick or treat," he just stood there, silent. The silence was heavy, unsettling. Hannah tried to break the tension. "Hey there," she said, forcing a smile. "Where are your parents?" "It's getting pretty late." The boy didn't answer. He didn't even seem to blink. He just stared. Feeling a growing unease, Hannah grabbed a handful of candy from the bowl and dropped it into his plastic pumpkin bucket. "Here you go," she said, her voice a little shaky. She quickly closed the door, locking it out of pure instinct. But a strange feeling made her look through the peephole just a few seconds later. He was still standing there, exactly where he'd been. Not eating the candy, not looking around, just facing her door. 10 minutes crawled by, then 20. Every time she nervously peeked through the peephole, he was there, a motionless silhouette in the faint glow of the street lamp. He hadn't moved an inch. Finally, thoroughly creeped out and frustrated, Hannah decided to ignore him. Maybe he'd just get bored and leave. She turned off all the downstairs lights, making the house look empty, and went upstairs to her bedroom, hoping to put the weird encounter out of her mind. But just as she was about to get into bed, she heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it wasn't soft. It was louder, more insistent. A demanding, rhythmic thud against her front door that seemed to echo through the entire house. Her heart pounding in her chest, she crept to her upstairs window, the one that looked directly down onto her front porch. And she saw him. He was still there, but he wasn't looking at the door anymore. His head was tilted all the way back, and he was staring straight up at her window, right at her. A cold wave of terror washed over her, but what truly froze her blood, what made her scream, wasn't his unnerving stare. It was the fact that his feet weren't touching the ground. He was floating just a few inches above the porch steps, as if held up by invisible strings. She scrambled for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed 911. The police arrived 20 minutes later, though it felt like a lifetime. They searched the entire area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. They found the candy bucket overturned on the porch, the candy spilled across the steps, but there were no footprints on the damp lawn. No sign of a child. No one. The only thing they found was a small, paper-thin clown mask lying right on her doorstep. When the officer picked it up and turned it over, he saw something scratched into the back in what looked like a child's handwriting. It said, "Trick or treat." Hannah. Every town has that one place, right? The one spot kids whisper about, the place they dare each other to visit after dark. For me and my friends, that place was Old Mercer's pumpkin patch. The stories about it were legendary, and not in a good way. The patch had been closed since 1998, ever since Old Man Mercer himself was found dead, right in the middle of his own jack-o'-lanterns. The most chilling detail? His eyes had been carved out, just like the pumpkins surrounding him. Classic small-town horror story. We ate it up. So, on Halloween night, armed with a camera and a ridiculous amount of teenage bravado, we decided to do it. We were going to conquer Old Mercer-esque pumpkin patch and get it all on film for a Ghost Challenge video. Liam was the ringleader, as usual. "Come on, guys, it'll be epic," he'd said. Maya was pretending to be brave, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. "And me, Dylan?" I was the one holding the camera, trying to capture our stupid, smiling faces as we hopped the rusted fence. The air inside was immediately different, colder, heavier. The moon was bright, casting long, distorted shadows from the withered pumpkin vines that crisscrossed the ground. We laughed and joked, pushing each other, making loud noises to fill the oppressive silence. "Oh, is that old man Mercer?" Liam would shout, pointing at a scarecrow slumping in the distance. We were all playing a part, pretending we weren't absolutely terrified. The field was huge, way bigger than it looked from the road. Rows and rows of pumpkins, some rotted and caved in, others surprisingly intact, sat like silent orange skulls in the moonlight. We pushed deeper into the patch, heading for the center, where Mercer's body was supposedly found. As we got closer, I noticed something through the camera's viewfinder, a flicker of light, then another. I stopped. "Hey guys, hold on a sec." They turned, their laughter dying down. In the center of the field, dozens of pumpkins were arranged in a wide circle, and inside every single one a candle was burning, their flames dancing and casting a warm, sinister glow. This place had been abandoned for over 20 years. Who could have lit them? That's when we heard it. A voice. It was low, raspy, like dry leaves scraping against stone. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Which one of you lit my candles?" We froze solid. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would break free. Liam's face was pale. Maya let out a small whimper. Our flashlights, which had been perfectly fine moments before, started to flicker and die, one by one, plunging us into near darkness, lit only by the eerie glow of the jack-o'-lanterns. The voice spoke again, closer this time, from somewhere between the rows of pumpkins just a few feet away. "I don't like visitors," a twig snapped, then another. Someone was moving, circling us in the dark. I frantically tried to get my flashlight working again, smacking it against my palm. Suddenly, Maya screamed. A piercing, blood-curdling shriek that cut through the night. I whipped the camera around to where she was pointing, and there it was. Standing motionless behind Liam, a tall, hulking figure in farmer's overalls. But it wasn't a man. Where its head should have been, there was a grotesque, grinning jack-o'-lantern, its carved eyes and mouth glowing with an internal fire. We didn't need a second invitation. We ran, blindly, we scattered, tripping over vines, stumbling through the mud, the sound of our own panicked breathing filling our ears. I kept running, the camera still recording, bouncing wildly. But no matter which way I turned, the field just seemed to stretch on forever. The rows of glowing pumpkins never ended. They were a maze and we were the rats. Days later, the police found my camera lying in the mud at the edge of the patch. My friends were gone. The official report said they probably just got spooked and ran off. But the footage on the camera told a different story. The final clip showed the field, perfectly still and empty under the morning sun. Everything looked normal, except for one detail. Right in the center of the field, there was a new pumpkin among the others, freshly carved, and its face, its terrified, screaming face, was mine. It was 11:45 p.m. on Halloween night, and Marissa was just catching the last bus home. The streets were eerily quiet, the only light coming from the flickering jack-o'-lanterns lining the sidewalks, their grins looking more menacing than cheerful in the darkness. As she stepped onto the bus, she noticed it was almost empty. There was just an old man sitting near the front, hunched over his cane, and the driver, whose face was hidden by the shadows. The doors hissed shut behind her, sealing her inside with the stale, cold air. She found a seat by a large window and pulled out her phone, scrolling through pictures from the Halloween party she'd just left. The bus rumbled on, its engine a low growl in the otherwise silent night. She barely looked up as they passed the first few stops, but then a strange feeling began to creep over her. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet hum that wasn't there before. She glanced up from her phone and looked at the reflection in the dark window beside her, and her heart stopped. The reflection wasn't just showing her and the old man. Behind her, row after row, were faint, ghostly silhouettes. They were people, or at least they looked like people, sitting perfectly still in the empty seats. They were transparent, like smoke, their forms wavering with the movement of the bus. Marissa blinked hard, convinced her eyes were playing tricks on her after a long night. She rubbed them and looked again. They were still there. The bus was filling up with silent, see-through passengers, her breath hitched in her throat. She slowly, so slowly, turned her head to look over her shoulder. The seats were empty. Absolutely empty. But when she looked back at the reflection, the phantoms were still there, their heads all facing forward. All except for one. In the reflection, a figure sitting just a few rows behind her was turning its head. It was a woman, her face pale and glistening as if she'd just been pulled from a river. She was wearing a tattered witch costume, dark hair plastered to her skull. Her eyes, wide and black, locked onto Marissa's in the reflection. Her mouth opened and she began to whisper, but no sound reached Marissa's ears. It was a silent, horrifying plea or a warning, she couldn't tell which. Panic seized her. Marissa scrambled out of her seat, her phone clattering to the floor. She stumbled toward the front of the bus, her eyes darting between the empty seats and their ghastly reflections in the window. "Driver!" she cried out, her voice trembling. "Driver, you have to stop. There's something wrong." She reached the front and grabbed the pole next to the driver's seat. "Please, you have to let me off." The driver didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. He just kept staring straight ahead at the empty road. Marissa's gaze flickered up to the large rearview mirror above him, and a scream tore from her throat. The face staring back from the mirror wasn't human. It was melting, dripping down like hot wax from a candle. The eyes, nose, and mouth were sagging, distorted into a grotesque, inhuman mask. The old man, who had been sitting quietly, was gone. The entire bus was now filled with the silent, staring specters, all of them turning to look at her. The bus slowed for a red light, and without a second thought, Marissa slammed her hand against the emergency door release. The doors flew open with a gasp of air as she leaped out, tumbling onto the cold pavement. She scrambled to her feet and spun around, ready to see the terrifying bus pull away. But there was nothing there. The street was completely empty. The bus had vanished into thin air. There was no sound of an engine, no trail of exhaust smoke, just the lonely flickering of the pumpkins on the curb. Shaking and hysterical, she called the police. Later that night, when they reviewed the traffic camera footage from that intersection, they found nothing. No bus had passed that way after 11:30 p.m. When they checked the transit authorities' records, they made a chilling discovery. The bus line Marissa claimed to have taken, it hadn't been in service for 3 years. It was discontinued after a tragic accident on Halloween night, where a bus, filled with passengers in costumes, had crashed, leaving no survivors. What do you think happened to Marissa on that bus? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Eli, a fresh-faced college kid, had just moved into his new dorm. It was the best week of the year, Halloween week, but his roommate, a total buzzkill, had already bailed to go home. So there Eli was all alone for the night in a dorm that felt way too big and way too quiet. Now this particular dorm had a weird tradition. A really weird one. There was this old, creepy mirror at the end of the main hall. The story, the one all the upperclassmen loved to tell, was that if you stood in front of it at exactly midnight on Halloween night and asked it to, it would show you the face of whoever was destined to take your soul. Eli, being a rational 21st century guy, thought this was all a bunch of nonsense. A classic college prank to scare the freshmen, so he had a brilliant idea. He'd record himself doing it. It would be hilarious. He could post it online, get a few laughs, and prove once and for all that the legend was just a stupid story. As the clock on his phone ticked closer to midnight, he felt a small, silly flutter of nerves, but he pushed it down. He walked down the dimly lit hallway, the only sound being the soft padding of his sneakers on the worn carpet. He stood before the mirror. It was huge, framed in dark, ornate wood, its surface cloudy with age. At 12 o'clock sharp, he raised his phone, pointed the camera at his own reflection, and with a smirk he spoke the words into the silence. "Show me my soul taker." He waited. 1 second, 2, nothing, a burst of laughter escaped him. See? Totally lame. He felt a wave of relief mixed with a little disappointment. It would have been a better story if anything had happened. He turned to walk back to his room, still chuckling to himself. And then he stopped, cold, his heart hammered against his ribs. In the reflection, someone was standing behind him. A tall, gaunt figure wearing a cracked white porcelain mask, the kind with a permanent, unsettling smile painted on it. Eli's breath hitched. He spun around, his eyes darting into the empty, silent hallway. There was no one there. Absolutely no one, his mind screamed at him. It's just a trick of the light. You're tired. It's your imagination running wild. He forced himself to look back at the mirror, and that's when the real terror began. The figure in the reflection was closer now. Its masked face was right over his shoulder, the cracked porcelain seeming to grin wider. Eli didn't even scream. The sound was trapped in his throat. He dropped his phone, the screen shattering on the floor, and bolted for his dorm room door. He fumbled with the handle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He twisted. It wouldn't open, locked. He pulled, he rattled, he threw his whole body against it, but it was like it was sealed shut. He risked one last, horrifying glance back at the hallway mirror, and what he saw made his blood run ice cold. The reflection still showed him standing there, frozen in front of the mirror, with the masked figure's hand resting on his shoulder. But he wasn't there. He was here, at his door, pounding and screaming. The him in the mirror wasn't moving. It was just a trapped image. The next morning, campus security finally managed to get the door open after a wellness check was called. The lights in the hall were flickering erratically. The ancient mirror was shattered into 1,000 pieces, littering the floor like jagged teeth. Eli was gone. The only thing they found was his phone. When they played back the last recording, past the laughter and the challenge to the mirror, there was just one more sound, right at the very end. A faint, raspy whisper, barely audible over the static. "You shouldn't have looked."